Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Fairwinds. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but first, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we want you to submit those using the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. That's also where you'll find the chat tab. And this is where we want you to engage with our discussion today. Let us know where you're from, or let us know your thoughts on what we have to talk about. We also have 2 polls throughout today's webinar, so we want your participation there. And before we close out, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So our topic today is NSA Kubernetes Hardening Guide, what you need to know. And joining me is Robert Brennan, Vice President of Product Development at Fairwinds, and Kendall Miller, Technical Evangelist at Fairwinds. Kendall, Robert, thank you both so much for being here with me. I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thank you, sir. We'll go ahead and dive in. So first of all, welcome, folks. This is the NSA Kubernetes Hardening Guide, what you need to know. Robert and I will be walking you through the things that we've learned, digging deeply in this. Robert has gone very deep through all this guide to understand what's there, because we work for a Kubernetes company that addresses these things. But we'll get to that. I do want to say we will have time for Q&A at the end. And Fairwinds makes software that addresses a lot of the things that the NSA is talking about. So we will have a brief demo at the end. And yeah, if you have questions, feel free to ask throughout, and we will try to address them either as we go or towards the end. But welcome. And I got a little bit of a throat thing, so I'm muting once in a while to clear my throat and not do it in your ear. But let's dive in. So real quick, Robert, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Robert Brennan. I'm VP of Product Development here at Fairwinds. I've been working with Kubernetes for about 4 years now, and in developer tooling for about 8 years. Super interested in security and open source software, and how to do Kubernetes securely.
Okay, yeah, and my name is Kendall Miller. I've been with Fairwinds for almost 7 years, which is a little creepy to say out loud, and I'm a technical evangelist on behalf of Fairwinds. So glad to be with you here today, and we are going to go ahead and dive in. So real quick, Fairwinds' mission is to help companies with Kubernetes security, policy, and governance so that folks can ship software faster. We have been in the Kubernetes world for almost all of the 7 years that we've been in business, and heavily focused on helping people use Kubernetes correctly. So a background in services, a shift to open source, and then software. And what we do today is build a lot of software, both open source and SaaS, that helps people use Kubernetes correctly. So Kubernetes isn't inherently hard, but it is a new paradigm for most people. And it's like if you've used Windows your whole life, moving to Linux is a really big shock. Once you're used to Linux, it's fine. It's the world you live in and swim in. But if all you've ever used is Windows, that's a shock. Same with Kubernetes. Once you're used to it, you really appreciate that paradigm, and you don't ever want to go back. But if you're new to it, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot that's surprising. And at Fairwinds, we help people get used to that adjustment, use the software correctly, deploy things into Kubernetes that actually work. So before we dive in further, let's ask you where you are in your Kubernetes journey, and we'll bring up a poll. So options are: I'm learning about containers in Kubernetes. I'm planning to use it in 6 to 12 months. I'm only using it in testing and development environments, or I'm using it in production. And if you choose one of those, once we have a few folks submitting things, we'll pull up those results live and show you what that looks like. Click your buttons. Right now, most of the folks that are coming in are using it in production. Here we go, up on your screen. learning about Kubernetes and using it in production in the lead. This tends to be the case on most of our webinars. It's people who are just exploring, just getting interested in it, and then people who are using it in production and want to be using it better. So I think there's always everything in between, but there's we're pretty sure we want to go this direction. We have no idea how to go this direction. Where do we get started crowd? And then there's also well, we bought in and we went all the way in, and man, we wish we were using it better. So that makes sense. But we'll let this go for a few more seconds so we can collect a few more responses. We do aggregate this over time just to understand how our audience is changing over time. And for what it's worth, there's way more people using it in production now than there was, even a year ago when we were doing these kinds of things. And we'll wrap up in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you. Great. Well, thanks, folks. And we'll go ahead and dive right in. So what is the Kubernetes Hardening Guide? This is a gold standard for doing Kubernetes securely. And, it's not very often that the NSA issues standards for how to use particular software. But I think part of it speaks to how broadly adopted Kubernetes has become. But speak a little bit about why this guide even exists, Robert.
Yeah, so Kubernetes is, it's a very complex system. It's super flexible. It's been adopted by a majority of the Fortune 500 at this point, and anything that's flexible enough to cover that many use cases is going to be complex to set up. And that complexity comes with a lot of security trade-offs, right? There are different ways to configure Kubernetes, either more or less securely. Generally there's a trade-off between ease of use and security. So there's a lot of decisions that folks need to make as they're setting up their clusters. And there are also a lot of just easy mistakes to make when you're setting up your cluster. So I think the NSA really wanted to, take this complex system and, look at it holistically and figure out, okay, what are the things that everybody needs to be doing in order to keep this secure? And what are the things that sort of the most paranoid, the most, security conscious companies really want to be doing in order to make sure that they have the most secure environment possible? So this is really, the NSA is notoriously paranoid from a security perspective. And so in this document, they really tackle everything you could possibly do to tighten your Kubernetes security profile.
Yeah, and it's great to have that ground level base setting for Kubernetes. I think the vast majority of people who use Kubernetes stand up an environment, they pick a few defaults, and they just go. And honestly, that's fine for a lot of organizations, but if you care about being securely locked down, which you should, particularly over time, particularly with success, particularly as you become better and better known, you're going to need to have things really tightly locked down. And clicking a button and getting a Kubernetes environment in one of the cloud environments does not equal a highly secure environment by default. So that's why these standards exist, and we're going to dive now into some of the specifics. Were you going to add something, Robert?
I was going to say that's a great point. It's pretty easy these days to just click a button in the AWS or GCP UI and get a cluster that's working, and you have a website that's facing the external web. But that's a far cry from doing it in a way that's secure, efficient, and scalable. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure it doesn't fall over, that you don't get attacked, et cetera. And because it's working in prod, a lot of folks just assume, it must be good, it must be ready to go. There's a lot you really need to think about before actually, shipping to production.
Yep. Yeah, there's a difference between having a production environment and having a secure production environment. So what does the NSA guide cover? So it's got 5 categories, starts with pod security, gets into network separation and hardening, authentication and authorization, also talks about audit logging and threat detection. You can have a super lockdown environment, but if you don't have a way to check, have we been hacked? Is there problems and is there anomalies and what's going on? You're going to miss things. And then upgrading and application security practices. So we're going to dive into each of these in a little bit of detail, read a few quotes from the guide itself, and then talk for a few minutes around why these things matter. Anything to add before I move on, Robert?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, good. Okay, so pod security. By default, many container services run as privileged root users because sudo make me a pod. Sounds better. And applications execute inside the container as root, despite not requiring privileged execution. Preventing root execution by using non-root containers or a rootless container engine limits the impact of a container compromise. So, talk about this, Robert.
So, anybody who's been using Kubernetes or is aware of it knows that the first step to getting an application deployed is to containerize it. But there's a lot of configuration that gets wrapped around that container to actually run it in a Kubernetes cluster. You have to tell Kubernetes things like how much memory and CPU it needs, and you have to provide a lot of security context. Basically, tell Kubernetes how much permission should this container have, how much access should it have to the host node that it's running on. And really 99% of the time, the container does not need any actual access to the host node it's running on. All it needs is that memory and CPU resource to get its job done. Unfortunately, Kubernetes doesn't ship by default with a lot of the tightest security controls. So that container does end up having a lot more access than it usually needs to the host environment. So it's super important to spend some time, looking at these configuration options and making sure that you're setting them appropriately. One big one that the NSA mentions here is running as root. You might think that a containerized application is containerized, it's separated from the host environment, but that's not entirely the case. There are a lot of things that the containerized environment shares with the host environment, for instance, user space. So if that container is running as root on the host node, and somebody, an attacker manages to get access to that container and somehow escape the containerized environment, they'll be running as root on the host node and they'll be able to do anything they want, basically affect any of the other applications running on that same node. So it's super important to take the time to make sure your application doesn't run as the root user, and you can actually adjust the Kubernetes configuration to disable the root user altogether. So that's a really important thing you should try and do for any application you're running in Kubernetes. There are a lot of other security configurations on top of that. Another good one is whether or not the file system is readable or writable. Most applications shouldn't need write access to the entire file system. They might need, a temp directory or something like that, which can be configured. But the root file system should be read-only by default. This is great to prevent an attacker from, downloading an external script, modifying your configuration to get your application to behave differently, et cetera. So, making sure that file system is read-only is a great way to tighten up your security.
Yeah, there's, talking about escaping a container, it might sound far-fetched, but there are many people who make a career out of this, both white hat and black hat. I have one friend who spends a lot of time doing this kind of thing and has even famously, broken out of a container on a mainframe just to see if they could do it. And, there's that kind of thing all the time. Hey, I'm going to get into this Kubernetes environment. I'm going to show you that I can't escape the container and I can run things on the host environment and I can escape further and further out from there. So a compromised container isn't inherently a compromised system, but it's one of the first steps. And it definitely is a very easy thing to solve in literally just changing the user privileges. So,
yeah. I would say maybe twice a year or so, there's a vulnerability announced that allows escaping that containerized environment. There are definitely several known ones. The messaging always basically says if you've pared down your security context by not running as root, et cetera, you're not vulnerable to this. If you have a container running as root, then you're vulnerable to it, that sort of thing. So it's super important to make sure you're tuning those down because new vulnerabilities are getting announced every month.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Let's move on. Network separation and hardening. RBAC, enabled by default, RBAC stands for role-based access control, is one method to control access to a cluster, to cluster resources, based on the roles of individuals within the organization. Role-based access control can be used to restrict access for user accounts and service accounts. So let's start, Robert, before you dive into this, to even just define role-based access control. I think it's relatively clear in the naming, but I think it's still helpful to just spell it out.
Yeah, so a big part of Kubernetes is what's called the control plane, which basically decides what resources are inside the cluster. It allows you to basically do CRUD operations, create, retrieve, update, and delete things inside of the cluster. And RBAC is a way of controlling who is allowed to do what inside the cluster, both in terms of actual, physical people, as well as, any automated service running inside the cluster. And so, using RBAC to make sure that you're separating out responsibilities, that applications are only allowed to do things that, they need to do in order to get their job done, that users are only allowed to do things that they need to do to get their job done, is a big part of Kubernetes security. So this part of the NSA guide is really all about, there's two aspects to it. One is separating that control plane from the, the individuals and the, applications that are modifying the control plane. And it's also about separating different workloads running inside the cluster.
Yeah. There's stories from many years ago when we had clients that were giving every person individualized access to every cluster in their organization, which was great until somebody would quit. And then they had to literally tear down all the clusters and stand them back up because they didn't have an easy way to revoke access because they just weren't, these are solved problems. Don't do things the hard way when you can do them the easier way. And, setting up just simple role-based access control does make this easy. To be clear, Fairwinds makes 2 open source projects in this realm. 2 or 3, Robert?
2. We have RBAC Manager and RBAC Lookup are 2 big open source projects. We also have a commercial project, Fairwinds Insights, which helps to audit RBAC roles and make sure that any particularly dangerous roles with a lot of access, or roles with the ability to escalate their permissions are highlighted.
Yeah. So, if you're struggling with just managing role-based access control, we make an open source project that makes that easy. And if you are doing that at significant scale, we have software that helps with that. So these are solved problems. Go ahead.
Yeah. The other big piece of this category is around network policy. This is something that most organizations starting to implement Kubernetes don't do on day one. But it's a good thing to practice, especially if you want a tightly secure environment. Network policy basically allows you to limit traffic between workloads in your cluster and between those workloads and the external internet. The NSA recommends having a default deny policy, meaning a workload that gets deployed to the cluster can't talk to anything else by default, and you have to create an allow list of things other workloads it's allowed to connect to, or external domains it's allowed to connect to. That can be a little bit overly restrictive, especially for a nimble startup. It can be a little frustrating to kind of deal with. You're trying to launch a new feature, but suddenly it can't connect to, GitHub or whatever external API it's supposed to connect to. But for a company that really wants to be tightened down in terms of security, starting with that default deny policy and then forcing folks to think through what exactly does this workload need access to is a really great way to tighten your security.
Now, Robert, when you say network separation, I hear Istio. Do you have to have service mesh and some big complicated add-on in order to set in place simple network separation, or can you do that before you have a big service mesh on top?
So Istio is definitely like the most heavyweight solution out there. We actually recommend Linkerd, which is a little bit more lightweight. It's a lot less intrusive of a service mesh. So it's up to you which service mesh you pick.
But you do need to have a service mesh in order to do basic network separation?
Yeah, you need some kind of network management tooling in there.
Okay, cool. Okay, let's move on. Authentication and authorization. Administrators must implement an authentication method or delegate authentication to a third-party service. Kubernetes assumes that a cluster-independent service manages user authentication. Robert?
Yeah, so this is all about how do folks get access to this Kubernetes environment if they need to log in, see what's in there, look at the logs for their application, et cetera. The big cloud providers like AWS and GCP will allow you to tie in their IAM concept into the Kubernetes cluster, so you can dynamically provision access to the cluster based on that person's IAM roles. That's how we recommend doing authentication with Kubernetes, is to use GCP or AWS IAM. If that's not an option for you, if you're running on-prem or something like that, you can use OIDC as a great tool for authenticating with the cluster using other authorization tools. But it's basically how does somebody go from I'm on my command line to I have a Kubernetes configuration that is allows me to start running kubectl commands and look inside the cluster, and also know, exactly what are my permissions, right? It's not just about authentication, but also about authorization. What am I allowed to do? And that ties back into the RBAC concept we were talking about before. Making sure that you have a set of roles for your company, maybe a developer role, an SRE role, an admin role, et cetera, and that you're assigning people to those roles based on their job description. That really helps to make sure that everybody, is adhering to the principle of least privilege, that they only have access to the things that they need in order to do their job. It also prevents, stupid mistakes from happening, right? If a developer logs in, maybe they don't need any, they just need read-only access to look at the logs. If you over-permission them and allow them to delete workloads, they could delete a workload out of production just because they're not entirely sure what they're doing. So making sure folks are only allowed to do the things that they need to do is a big part of important part of having a production Kubernetes environment.
The number of outages in the world that happen because the person just didn't know what they were doing is quite significant. The oops outage is maybe one of the most common outages. So yeah, there's simple things you can do to prevent your users from having more access than they need. They don't want to make the mistake either. They want you to protect them. So do so.
Exactly.
Okay, let's keep going. Audit logging and threat detection. System administrators running applications within Kubernetes should establish an effective logging and monitoring system for their environment. Logging Kubernetes events alone is not enough to provide a full picture of the actions occurring on the system. I'm going to read that sentence again. Logging Kubernetes events alone is not enough to provide a full picture of the actions occurring on the system. Logging should be performed at all levels of the environment, including on the host, application, container engine, container engine, image registry, that's a mouthful right there, API server, and the cloud as applicable. Talk about what is the difference between just logging and having active threat detection, and why is logging Kubernetes events alone not enough, Robert?
Yeah, so there's a few pieces to this puzzle. One is the Kubernetes audit logs, which basically log everything the API server does. Those can be configured to log more or less based on your particular needs. Those are helpful as just like a backup in case something does happen. There is a security event or something like that, and you want to go back and look through those. But it's such a fire hose of data; it's almost too much. In addition to that, you want to be logging, basically all the standard out and standard error from every single thing that's running inside of Kubernetes, inside of a container. That's a great way to really understand kind of what's going on. What are the kube system workloads doing? Kind of the core Kubernetes layer, as well as any of your applications. A great way to kind of get all this for free is to go with Datadog as a solution here. If you install the Datadog daemon set into your Kubernetes cluster, it will suck up all those logs and send them out to Datadog where they'll be permanently stored. That's a big piece actually of a good logging strategy, is make sure you're storing those logs outside of the cluster so that if something does happen to your cluster, you have that persistent state where you can go back and look and figure out what happened. If you're just storing them in the cluster, then they can easily disappear. The cluster is very much an ephemeral place.
And to be clear, Robert, you said one way to get that for free, but what you mean is out of the box, because it's probably not free with Datadog. If you want it for free, you go with a Prometheus-like solution or something. But keep going. Yeah. Another piece of this is just the monitoring aspect, right? The alerting aspect. So once you have those logs, you have to make sure that you're watching for any events that could cause an outage, say. So pods crashing, anything that keeps restarting, things running out of memory, error logs, things like that. You should be able to get alerts on. So using a solution like PagerDuty is a great way to do that. Making sure that folks are, the right people are getting alerted at the right time for any events that occur that are suspicious. Yeah. Audit logging, having logs run constantly without a way to check or be alerted on them is sort of like installing an alarm system at a house you don't live in and never checking to see if the alarm went off. Things went bad and somebody, it was written down somewhere, but nobody was notified. You're kind of missing some of the points. Also, yeah, logging, just the Kubernetes events alone is insufficient. There's all layers of that as well that you need to be checking for, which you touched on. But yeah, there's a lot more than just Kubernetes events, like you mentioned. Okay, I feel like there was something more I wanted to say about this. Anything else to add, Robert, or did we cover that good?
Yeah, so the last bit that we'd like to recommend here is considering using Falco, which is a tool that essentially monitors the low-level application events happening on every single node inside your Kubernetes environment. And it looks for specific patterns of events that are suspicious. So that could be something like patterns of crypto miners. It could be access to really sensitive files, things like that. And it can surface up those events inside the Falco UI or send them out to a third-party service like Fairwinds Insights. You can set up monitoring and alerting on those specific patterns of suspicious events. That's again, it's a very heavyweight tool because it needs to run on every single node in your environment. It consumes a lot of data. It produces a lot of data, but it's a great tool for detecting any intrusion in your environment. Making sure that if an attacker does gain access and try to do something nefarious, Falco can pick up on that and make sure that your security team or your ops team is alerted.
Yeah, and Falco runs what at the kernel level? Where does Falco run?
So it runs actually using eBPF these days, which is a fairly new way of monitoring events occurring on a Linux machine. So it runs a workload basically on every single node inside of your cluster. And it is one of those workloads that actually does need additional pod security policy permissions to basically get access to the host node's infrastructure, so it can listen for those events.
Yeah, but it's a very, very low level. Like you're starting at Kubernetes events and then all the way down to Falco being one of that lowest of the levels that you're checking for everything, right? Okay. Let's move on, and I think this is the last bit, upgrade and application security practices. So security is an ongoing process, right? Nobody is secure, check that box, go have lunch, call it a day, we did it. That'd be nice if that's how security was. And it is vital to keep up with patches, updates, and upgrades. The specific software components vary depending on the individual configuration. Each piece of the overall system must be kept as secure as possible. This includes updating Kubernetes, hypervisors, virtualization software, plugins, operating systems on which the environment is running, applications running on the servers, all elements of the organization's continuous integration and continuous delivery pipeline, and any other software hosted in the environment. I have a lot to say about this, but why don't you start?
Yeah, I would say this is one of the hardest and most costly aspects of running a Kubernetes environment. There are constantly new patches and releases coming out, new vulnerabilities getting discovered that need to be patched. And often those changes come with breaking changes, right? So you need to be constantly on top of it, reading release notes, etc. This goes for the core Kubernetes version, right? Kubernetes, I think, maintains versions for about a year in support, and then they fall out of support. So if you're not updating at least every year, then you're out of support. You're potentially getting hit with security holes, things like that. So super important to stay up to date there. There's also all the add-ons that you have running in your cluster, things like Nginx Ingress for doing ingress management, Cert Manager for managing your certificates, Istio or Linkerd for your service mesh. All those need to stay up to date as well. So making sure that you're subscribed to any new releases that come out, making sure you're staying on top of those releases, staying on top of any breaking changes, super, super important. And then last is, at the application layer for whatever applications you're deploying in for your own workloads, your API servers, whatever else. You need to make sure that those are staying up to date, not only with your team's changes, but with, like the underlying operating system that you're running on top of. Maybe you're running on top of an Ubuntu operating system or a little more tightened down with Alpine. There are new CVEs getting released for those operating systems all the time. So you have to make sure that underlying operating system stays up to date. Super, super important. Again, just because that container, looked like it was, not vulnerable at the point that it was shipped into the cluster, does not mean it stays, free of vulnerabilities. There could be a new vulnerability announced, a week later. And so you have to make sure you're continuously scanning, making sure that you don't have any vulnerable images inside of your Kubernetes environment.
Yeah, so the one thing I'd take issue with is you said this is one of the hardest things about managing a Kubernetes environment, but honestly, you're going to have to manage this wherever you're doing it, unless you're using a PaaS that's going to manage all of this for you, and you give it your code and nothing else, and everything else is done behind the scenes. But even then, your code's going to have vulnerabilities and staying on top of that. So like, this always needs to be done. The one thing that Kubernetes does is because there's enough. Kubernetes is making a standardized, uniform way of running everything. So if you have good tooling for monitoring everything in Kubernetes, you have good tooling for monitoring all the things. And so now you're probably running things outside of Kubernetes, so you need that. But those kinds of bits, it does standardize a few things. And to give a couple of examples here, Robert's talking about you don't want to ship things into the cluster that are broken. Just think about the Log4j episode that we had recently. As soon as that announcement comes out, you want your tooling to stop deployments of Log4j. You do not want, or at least the vulnerable versions of it, right? So you want tooling that watches and says, hey, this is running a vulnerable version of a thing that we know is broken. Don't deploy that into production. But also, we've already deployed 10 of them and they're running in production. So you also need a way to scan what's been running in production because it wasn't a known CVE when it was deployed a week ago. And so those are the kinds of like very practical situations where this pops up. And there have been a lot of these very practical situations in very recent memory, and having good tooling in place that, is scanning all of the things all along the way is going to be a big help.
Yeah, totally agree.
So, well, Robert, if only there was a way to do most of these things in an easy package. Do you know where I can find something like that? So, yeah, there's. I'm going to go ahead and jump into a demo and show you Fairwinds software, which we build a software tool called Fairwinds Insights that addresses many of these things, and we're going to show you how some of that works. And Robert, as I'm going, if you want to interrupt me and let me know, hey, point out this specific thing or that specific thing, that would be helpful for this as well, given the context. But let's tell you real quick at a high level what Fairwinds Insights is, and then I'll dive into the demo, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the specific bits that we address. But Kubernetes is complicated. Insights exist to be the governance and security from CI through to production. Everyone's having a hard time adjusting to Kubernetes. Having the tools in place that keep you from making all the mistakes that we just talked about are a big part of why Fairwinds Insights exists. We've been around doing this since before the NSA hardening guidelines came out, but this is the space that we were already playing in and continue to play in. So when you log into Fairwinds Insights, you're going to get an organizational overview that tells you some of the top issues that you have. But I'm going to show, I've clicked into the cluster view. In this organization, I have this, number of clusters running. You can see there's a staging and a prod for most of these. We track a health score over time, list the number of action items that are currently issues within the cluster, and then give you an overall health score for the organization. So now I can click into... I'm going to click into Proxima Prod, which actually I already have up over here. And this is going to show you where action items have been introduced into the cluster. So Fairwinds Insights is scanning the cluster for a whole bunch of different things. You can see over here on the right, we've got 27 critical issues running, but we've checked for almost 3,000 total things across the cluster. Now, some of this is checks run repeatedly of the same kinds of things on different workloads, but we're tracking over time. This bar, anything above the bar, is when action items are introduced to the cluster, and if they're red, they're critical, and if they're yellow, they're high, that kind of thing. And anything that's green is when action items have been knocked out of the cluster. And so, in theory, this health score is going to improve over time, and we have an A- on this cluster. We show you top action items across the cluster. We show you some of the cost pieces in this, and we're not going to show you everything today. I am going to show you bits of this in a second, but that's what's going on here at that overview. Now you can click into the action items, and we're going to give you this big long list of here's all the things that are going on. You can see the vast majority of the issues that we have in this cluster are medium severity. We do have a number of critical issues. But this is across all my clusters, not just that one cluster. But you can sort by specific clusters. You can sort by categories. You can choose, security, reliability, efficiency. The security issues tend to be the critical issues. That's not always the case, but most of the time, an efficiency issue like your workload's not working quite as well as it could is not a critical alert. It's more a, hey, you should probably fix that. Where you have something misconfigured on a security side, or there's a known CD, that's going to be a critical alert. So you can click into any of these and it's going to tell you what report it came from. This is coming from Kubebench. It's going to give you a description of the issue that it found and then tell you how to go about fixing it. So you don't have to be a super senior Kubernetes engineer in order to be able to knock these things out, because we're trying to spoon feed you as much information as possible so that you can go iterate on these issues. Now, a lot of people that I talk to, when they see this list, like this is a big, long list of lots of issues that the platform team needs to go knock out. And they go, hey, Kendall, I don't want my job to be a lot harder. I know that I'm doing things wrong. What I don't need is an itemized list of everything I'm doing wrong. So it's true, like this can be overwhelming for platform or DevOps teams, which is why we've shifted this burden left to the developer in a significant way. So the way that the average developer is going to be working on this is here we have a developer named Robert Brennan who's pushing some code that says it's going to break some things. And you can see Circle CI has passed the tests for this, but Fairwinds Insights has failed it, saying 5 new action items found. So Robert is your standard developer pushing something into Kubernetes, doesn't know, hey, I should have set permissions differently, or I should have, whatever it is. Kubernetes is a new paradigm. He doesn't know. Robert happens to know. This is all an example, but like in theory, you have developers that don't know entirely what they're doing. And here's a process where it's going to stop bad things from getting entered into the cluster before they're a problem. So to the example we were just giving, log4j, known CD running, that kind of thing can stop that kind of deployment from going through. But then the developer clicks on this, it loads them into the GUI, says, hey, here's the problems that you have. Fix these, or fix these high criticality issues, and then you'll be able to deploy. So then it says, this is the description of what's wrong. Here's the remediation, so how you can go about fixing it. So now a standard developer can go back in, make the tweaks according to what they've read here without having to say, hey, platform team, just make my things deploy, please. And in theory, that cluster score is going to improve over time, because as new things are deployed into the cluster, they're going to be stopped from deploying problematic workloads, misconfigured workloads. There's a lot more to show you here. I want to jump over to the efficiency side over here, which I have loaded up, where I am logged into the Proxima Prod cluster here. We show you relative total cost across all the different workloads that you're using, as well as relative daily cost, and we track that over time. And then we're going to give you recommendations based on your desired quality of service for a specific workload. So you can see here we have a Prometheus service that we have said, the quality of service is critical. And so this is the average total cost that it's costing you to run this workload. But if you take our recommendations, it's going to go down a little bit. Now, in this case, we're going to save you $1.11 a month. That's not a whole lot. It's one pod. It's a Prometheus server. There are places where people are running hundreds of pods or much, much more, and they're wildly over-provisioned because the developer just didn't know what they were doing. And so they over-provisioned it. And, I tell people, spend some time with our sales team in a proof of value, install the agent, run it on a cluster, even in a staging environment. You're going to be shocked at how much you can save, how wildly things are over-provisioned, or in some situations under-provisioned. Now, that's the other thing is we do tell you if you've under-provisioned a workload. And if you have a quality of service that says it needs to be higher and you are running with resource requests and limits that are too low, we will tell you that and ask you to spend more money as well. So we're approaching the problem from correct configuration, not just save you money, although it usually does save you money, but it's also going to help you if you've wildly under-provisioned things. So that's the efficiency tab. We do give some specific cost analysis based on what cloud you're in, if it's AWS or GCP. And if it's AWS, you can get some pretty accurate cost details in there. I'll show you a few other things here. So in this cluster, I can go into add-ons. I get an alert that some of the add-ons that I'm running are out of date. Tells me if the version of whatever this add-on is deprecated. So Cert Manager isn't deprecated. However, I am running an out-of-date version. There is a newer version than the one that I'm running. So this is helpful for staying on top of all those add-ons that are running inside the cluster. Gosh, there's a lot to show you. I'm not going to go into everything. We do highlight vulnerabilities so that you can see what's going on there. You can apply this to specific repositories and get feedback from just your code. So even if something's not running in production, you can still attach insights to it and get feedback on what's misconfigured. We have a compliance dashboard, so you can go in and report certain things and have an easy way to generate reports for your auditors. And then the last few things I'm going to show you are, we do have a way to create custom policy. This is using OPA, the Open Policy Agent, which has sort of become the standard for writing custom policy. You can enforce that across, in the action items list, so that alerts are in the action items list, or it's enforced in CI/CD or at the admission controller level. And finally, we also have a way to write custom automation. So let's say anytime a new issue is introduced in this namespace or this application, it kicks out to a Jira ticket and tags such and such a person, so that doesn't have to be done manually as you go. Again, lots more here. I'm intending to whet your appetite around what this tool exists to do. It does help you meet a lot of these NSA hardening guidelines. Simple things like don't run as root. We're always checking for that. And if you set your standards, you just use the out-of-the-box standards, you're going to be a significant percentage of the way towards that NSA hardening guidelines. And let's go to this slide where we talk about some of that. Robert, can you talk us through some of the example things that Insights does that are related to what we've been talking to today?
Yeah, so one of the categories where Insights really shines is that first category of pod security. Which I would argue is one of the more important ones, because that's where the ops team has the least amount of control, right? A lot of times it's the development teams that are in control of those things, and it's hard for the ops team to police everything the dev team does. So Insights can check for all the issues that the NSA highlights in the pod security section, as well as a couple others, as well as issues that relate to like reliability and efficiency. So like making sure you're setting CPU and memory requests, making sure you're setting liveness and readiness probes, things like that. We can not only check for that to make sure like anything in the cluster has those things, we can check it in CI/CD and say block a pull request if somebody tries to merge something that is lacking one of those checks that you've decided is necessary for all your developers' workloads. We can also run it in an admission controller. So even if they're bypassing the CI/CD process, trying to kubectl apply something, we can deny it at the time of admission into the Kubernetes cluster if it doesn't meet your organization standards. So it's a really great way to take care of that pod security set of issues.
And to write that policy once and have it enforced in both levels if you need it to be, so that you don't have to run one tool that's enforcing it in CI and run a different tool to enforce it in the admission controller level.
Yeah, and it enforces it in CI, admission, and in the cluster, and it can enforce it across your entire fleet of clusters, across all your repositories. Again, you just have to write it once, upload it to the platform, and then it federates out everywhere.
Yeah, great. Were you done, or did I interrupt you? Sorry.
So the other thing that I can add here is that you can create a custom list inside of Insights of all your NSA-related security findings. There's a bullet point here at the bottom that kind of tells you how to do that. We highlight the specific reports that surface up NSA type findings. So Insights, integrates a bunch of different open source tooling. One is Polaris, which checks some of these pod level things. One is KubeHunter, which does a lot of essentially pen testing, automated pen testing inside of your Kubernetes environment. KubeBench checks for adherence to the SIS benchmark, which overlaps a lot with the NSA guides. Trivy looks for containers that are running known vulnerabilities, and OPA runs any custom policies that you've defined for your particular organization.
Yeah, so creating this list is going to give you a short list of all the things that are specifically related to security and these kinds of guidelines.
Exactly.
Great. Yep. And, this is where Fairwinds sits. We're here to help with security. Most companies lack visibility into security and compliance, particularly in their Kubernetes environment. Maybe they have it in their broader cloud context, but they don't know how to see into that in the Kubernetes environment. Over-provisioning and wasted resources, cost optimization. We see this very, very commonly. And that's just because most people don't have any idea what kind of workload requests and limits they should set for their services, especially if they have real service ownership where the developer's just like, I don't know, put some gigs on it. Maybe it's 10 gigs of whatever, and they hand wave and hope it never goes down. So wild over provisioning is very common. And then finally, just that policy and guardrails to truly enable service ownership and consistency across your organization. So writing policy, putting guardrails in place so that people aren't making bad mistakes. Some of what we talked about earlier with even just, the right level of authorization to do things. That's what you're putting in place with Fairwinds Insights is like, your developers aren't trying to cause an outage. Help them not cause an outage by putting in place the guardrails that are going to help them use Kubernetes correctly. So now, there's already been one question that's come through. Please feel free to ask more questions. We're going to get to Q&A here in just a second. There's a couple questions that have come through now. And let's open up this poll. What is the greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? Getting help with the basics, general best practice assessments, improving the security posture of your clusters, saving money, or improving the reliability of apps running in Kubernetes. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Check one of those, and then we'll see the results flow in here in a second. People are not pressing buttons. Press buttons if you want to see the results. So there we go. Now we got some. Okay. Looks like most of the folks are choosing improving your security posture of your clusters. And Cody, if you can bring that up on screen so folks can see. There we go. Yep. 50% are landing there. General best practice assessments. Oh, that's increasing. We'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll wrap up with some details and get to Q&A, but we like seeing these responses, so keep them coming for a minute more here. And by a minute, I mean a few more seconds, like I said before. Obviously, a few more seconds, minute, same thing. Okay, we'll close the poll in 10, 9, 8, press the button, hit submit. 3, 2, 1. Okay, good. Well, thanks. That's helpful feedback for us too as we continue to plan these kinds of webinars, knowing how folks need to improve and where they are in their life cycle is helpful for us. So we have recently released a white paper that Robert spent a lot of time digging into all of these details and writing about what this actually means. You want to make steps towards meeting the NSA Kubernetes Hardening guidelines. We have a white paper that shows you how to do that. There is a link here you can go to that will give you a demo, or you can even just punch in this other link to go straight to that NSA hardening guideline. So we've talked at a high level about what a lot of these things are. The white paper gets into some of the nitty-gritty of things that you can actually do to move towards this, how to do it in a practical way. And of course, you can always just come talk to us about Fairwinds Insights. Honestly, in a proof of value, you install the agent, you load it up, you're going to find out just how far off or how close you are. It's probably worth your time to get that demo and see just how close or not you are to have a real feeling for that. So let's go over to Q&A. Yeah, Dave is saying we'll also send a link to the guide after the webinar. So in the Q&A, okay, a couple questions we've got here. Number one, what type of company should care about meeting the NSA Kubernetes guidelines? Robert, what kind of company should care about that?
So I think every company should care about the guidelines themselves and looking at them and studying them. I think it's up to your organization how much in line you want to be with these guidelines. As we said before, they're like particularly strict. They're particularly paranoid. So it's probably not for every organization to implement every single one of the guidelines. I think, if you are the NSA, if you're, a state level, security organization, you probably want to meet all of them. If you're in an industry that's tightly regulated security wise, like healthcare or finance, you might want to get most of these guidelines met. If you're in a nimble startup, you've only got a few users, you're just, you're not working with any PII or anything like that. Maybe you can avoid having a default deny network policy. or some of the more paranoid aspects of the NSA guidance, but it's something that every kind of company running Kubernetes should study, be familiar with, understand, what is the risk profile of all these different things. What should I be doing as we grow? What should I be doing now? It's important to make those decisions early on to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success and you're not building up a bunch of tech debt.
Yeah, I think all of operations, anybody who works in this field knows that everything is a trade-off, right? The more securely locked down everything is, it's a little bit harder to iterate. It's a little bit harder for people to onboard. It's a little bit harder to get things done and shipped. So there's trade-offs. But the other piece of that is how easy is it to implement good, sane rules, and how easy is it to enforce them? And so having tooling in place that makes implementing sane defaults very easy out of the box, like Fairwinds Insights, like some of the things that you'll see in this white paper, that's going to make it a lot easier. Implement some sane defaults, use tooling that makes it easier out there, because you can go, it's not you're secure or you're insecure. You're going to land somewhere in the middle. Most people are going to land somewhere in the middle. I should say, because there are probably some environments out there that are literally doing absolutely everything wrong, but that's not common. So choosing sane defaults right in the middle and tooling that's going to help get you there is one other piece that you should have on your radar. Okay, let's see. What are some of the best options for learning about containers and Kubernetes security, such as the best training companies in the market today? I don't know if I know of great training companies. I mean, our white paper is a great place to go look for Kubernetes security. You could go read the NSA hardening guidelines. I mean, part of the reason this white paper exists is Robert read it, so you don't have to. And he's going to give you some practical, like, Cliff's notes in some sense. But are there places that are obvious to you, Robert, for great training around this?
Just raw training, not so much. I would say there are companies that do some like hands-on services driven help with Kubernetes, which honestly can be super helpful as you're getting up and running, especially if you have a team that isn't as familiar with Kubernetes. There are a lot of pieces of Kubernetes that it's hard to. You kind of just need to develop an intuition for it. You need to have seen it go wrong 100 different ways. You need to combine both kind of a general knowledge of Kubernetes with a knowledge of your particular application architecture, et cetera, to understand all the risks and all the options available to you. So just finding a partner who can work hands-on, I think is super important.
Yeah, and there's Fairwinds has participated in a competition called Clustered, and it's run by the Raw Code Academy, where we are handed a cluster and a competitor is handed a cluster, and we can break the cluster in a certain number of ways, or we have 24 hours to break the cluster and then hand it off to the other. And it's streamed live on YouTube. It's also recorded. You can go find that. Watching people actively try to break things and actively try to fix things is a good way to learn about some basic security and sort of get trained, because you see not just this is how it's broken and this is how to fix it, but you watch people go through the problem solving process of could it be this, could it be that, what about this? And that's really the skill set that's going to be most valuable to you in terms of training.
Also, just use this as an opportunity to mention Kube Crash, which is an event we're sponsoring on May 17th that just does some Kubernetes crash courses. We're there with a few other big Kubernetes vendors. It'll be a good place to just kind of learn the basics of Kubernetes, understand, all the different security issues, things like that.
Yep. And there's a few other things here, but I think we'll wrap up here for time's sake and turn it back over to you, Cody. So I want to say thanks to everyone for coming. If you have further questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch. We do Kubernetes for a living. That's all we do. It's all we think about. Okay, well, we also have personal lives in theory. But we're happy to talk about this. So feel free to reach out. If you want to take a deeper look at our software, we're happy to set up a proof of value, set it, install it in a demo environment for you and let you kick the tires and find out what you're going to learn from it. So it costs you very little. And by that, I mean zero to do a demo. So please feel free to reach out. And if you have other questions, you know where to find us. And Cody, thanks for hosting. I'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Robert and Kendall, for joining us today and for gracing all of our computer or tablet or phone screens with your faces and voices today. So I really appreciate your time. I'd like to quickly remind our audience that the session was recorded. So following the panel, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also rewatch it on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. So we do have those 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give away. Our first winner is Zhao N. Our second winner is Sebastian P. Our third winner is Neil O. And our fourth and final winner is Barbara H. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. I would like to thank Fairwinds for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you for participating in our polls. We ask for 1 extra moment of your time to fill out a brief post-webinar survey that will pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we do hope to see you at a future upcoming TechStrong Learning webinar. Everyone, have a great rest of your day. And Kendall and Robert, again, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Cody.